Welcome, everyone. We will just wait maybe a couple minutes for Mr. Çavuşoğlu to join us, and then we'll begin with the panel. Thank you. Okay. Great. Welcome, everyone, to today's session on NATO Beyond 75, an alliance fit for the future, here at the Bled Strategic Forum. My name is Masha Otvierk, and I lead the research on European foreign and security policy at the Wilson Center Global Europe Program, which is a foreign policy think tank based in Washington, D.C. I'm originally from Slovenia, so naturally I'm very delighted to be here at Bled to moderate that panel and to attend what has been really a series of truly excellent and thought-provoking discussions. And I would like to thank the organizers, especially Peter and Matej, who worked with us to put together this excellent panel for you today. And I have no doubt that our session will continue with this trend of excellent discussions, as I have with me today a series of great speakers to discuss what's in store for NATO in the next 75 years. As you all know, this year, the Alliance celebrated its 75th anniversary with a summit in the city where it all started in 1949, Washington, D.C. While there were many reasons to celebrate what has been assessed as the most successful defensive alliance, the summit was also a critical moment for assessing how well the alliance is adapting to a rapidly changing security landscape that we're living in. Allies agreed to important steps to strengthen deterrence and defense, bolster long-term support for Ukraine, and deepen NATO's partnerships. So I think today's panel comes at a right time to take stock of what was agreed at the Washington Summit, and where do we go from here for NATO to continue its mission of being a successful defensive alliance. And before we dive in, I'm going to shortly introduce all of our speakers. And we'll first start with Mr. Angus Lapsley, who is the NATO Assistant Secretary General for Defense and Policy Planning. He served over 30 years as a diplomat for the UK and was also, among other things, Director General for Strategy and International in the UK's Ministry of Defence. Next, we have Mr. Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, currently serving as a member of the Turkish Parliament and also the head of the Turkish delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Mr. Çavuşoğlu has a long-standing diplomatic and political career, served, among other things, as a Turkish foreign minister for over 8 years. Then we have Dr. Damir Črnčec, State Secretary at the Slovenian Ministry of Defense, also a long-standing career in national and international security, among other things, was the National Security Advisor to the former Slovenian Prime Minister Marjan Šarec. Mr. Alexandre Scorsia, a French career diplomat with almost 20 years of experience in security policy affairs, including serving as the Deputy Permanent Representative of France to NATO between 2019 and 2023. Ambassador Philip Rieker, chair of the Wilson Center Global Europe Program and partner and lead at the Europe and Eurasia practice at DGA Albright Stonebridge Group. Ambassador Rieker served as the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia during both Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Blinken. Next, we have Ms. Robin Quimwell, Director of the Wilson Center Global Europe Program. She spent more than 30 years as a US diplomat, including serving at NATO, and was most recently the chargé d'affaires at the US Embassy in Berlin. And last but not least, we also have Mr. Valerio De Luca, founding president of the Academy for Innovation, Economic Development and Security, and director of Digital Policy Council. Welcome, everyone. Since we have a very, very busy panel, we will dive right in to leave some time as well for questions from the audience. And I will start with Assistant Secretary General Lapsley. From its founding, NATO was a defensive alliance. And as we have seen, its track record has remained very successful until this day. And this was reiterated at the last NATO summit as well, with important decisions taken to further continue its role in terms of deterrence and defense. In your current role, you're responsible for NATO's capabilities, defense policy and planning. And as we move ahead or away from the summit, what will be your priorities for NATO to achieve these goals?
Well, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Blair and to the Wilson Centre. And it's fantastic to see so many people in the room for a discussion about NATO, which I think is a sign of the times. But look, so in essence, NATO has reset its deterrence and defence policy following the Madrid and the Vilnius summits. And what the Washington summit did was it sort of pushed that forward and confirmed we were going in the right direction. And that approach, that strategy, is based, first of all, on a military strategy, which is then wrapped up in our strategic concept. And that is essentially about recognizing that, above all, we face a probably long-term strategic competition with Russia. We face other threats as well. Of course, we face the perennial threat of terrorism, and that still remains an important preoccupation for NATO. But Russia is the threat which absorbs most of our energy at the moment. First of all, you have to deal with the fact that Russia is challenging us all the time, daily, in ways that stop short of actually going to war. And I think actually one of the things we have felt even over this summer is that the nature and the intensity of that challenge from Russia continues to rise. Disinformation, sabotage, assassinations, aggressive espionage, it's all climbing. So first of all, you need to deal with that, and you need to push back on it, you need to call it out and expose it and challenge it. Secondly, and this brings us to the military deterrence side of things, we absolutely need to be able to convince Russia and demonstrate to Russia that we would stop them at our borders if they ever challenged NATO militarily. Hence the emphasis on a strong forward defense, on reinforcement, on being able to bring conventional military force to bear very, very quickly on our borders. Thirdly, we need to convince Russia we would hurt them if they tried and did this, that we would have the conventional power to hit back at Russia in all sorts of ways. And then fourthly, as has been the case right from the beginning of NATO's history, we're a nuclear alliance. So all of this is underpinned by our nuclear capabilities, which I think, as we've seen over the last 2 years, are really important because they take away Russia's ability to coerce NATO in a nuclear way. Now, all of that requires a quite profound reset of our defense structures here in Europe at the moment. Organizing our forces, getting our command and control structures in the right place, and above all, investing in capabilities. And as you asked me, what is my single biggest priority this autumn following Washington? It's the fact that this autumn we will be entering into very detailed conversations with every ally about what capabilities they are going to need to invest in over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years in order to be able to fully implement those plans. And it's a demanding ask. It really is. It's not an unrealistic ask. We're not asking allies to go back to the height of the Cold War or even the end of the Cold War. We're asking allies, though, to invest in capabilities in a number of key areas. We know it will cost, which is why when we say in NATO that allies need to spend at least 2% of GDP, we really mean it. And many allies will have to spend way above 2% in the 2.5, even 3% range, depending on your kind of circumstances as an ally. They also need to find the people to make this real, and they need to find the industrial capacity as well. So I think it's, from a defence and deterrence perspective, and there's a lot we'll no doubt come on to talk about Ukraine, but it's those three things. It's invest in the capabilities through money, people, and industrial capacity that will allow us to meet that demand in future.
Great, thank you. I think you really painted a great picture in terms of all the challenges, next to, of course, Russia being the primary challenge, but also what all that encompasses in terms of the various aspects and challenges that NATO is dealing with. And I think this was also already addressed in the strategic concept, but the Washington Declaration addressed the wide range of issues, not only Russia, but also in terms of the rising China, or in terms of hybrid threats that are coming. And I will turn now to Mr. Çavuşoğlu and ask, these are various challenges that need to be addressed at the same time. We cannot pick and choose, unfortunately. So how do you see, from your perspective, NATO balancing these challenges? And then maybe to go on from there, are there any other challenges that you see the alliance should pay more attention to for the future?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Very happy to be here. NATO's military capability is important, and we just heard from our colleague and friend where NATO should invest more and transform this investment to the innovative technologies and the cyber, hybrid, and space and other threats we have to face all together. But politically, there are some areas that I want to touch a little bit. First of all, the current system, global system, and Western-dominated system has been challenged. And the system is fragmented. The world is multipolar right now. There is no unipolar world. Therefore, NATO needs to be more strategic and visionary to adapt this new era. Secondly, it is emanating again from this change of or challenging the system. There's a division. This great power fight or competition has been deepening the division between the superpowers or West and the middle powers. They have been raising their voices. Therefore, NATO could and should do more to have better dialogue with South and middle power. And to do so, to be successful in that, and NATO should act with prudence and justice. NATO should try to understand the expectations of this global South and the middle powers, because particularly global South is criticizing us for being double standard or even hypocrisy and the different crises, like the difference between or difference of our attitudes at Gaza and Ukraine. Therefore, we should understand them, and we should also learn how to reach out the middle powers and to seek, we need to seek better cooperation with those middle powers as well. Of course, there are new challenges or threats emanating from the South: terrorism, irregular migration, smuggling, trafficking, and other sort of. Then we need to also cooperate with them to face all these threats and challenge as well. And there is a shift in the center of economic power from west to east. It means Asia is emerging. And I believe that there is no difference between the security concerns of Asia and Europe. And there is no difference between the relations between Europe and Asia and United States and Asia. Therefore, we should also have better cooperation with the Asian actors, and we should refrain seeking the new amenities over there or the divisions. We shouldn't seek for new divisions in Asia, and we should take the benefit of this, the new economic power there. And the competition or the concern between Europe and the NATO. And I think we should strengthen or deepen the unity within NATO. And there are concerns, some of them are, to my mind, not very legitimate, but particularly European allies are concerned with the possible decline of the US interest to NATO. I don't think there will be a decline. What US is expecting is better burden sharing, equitable burden sharing, which is very fair. And that is why, as European allies, we have been investing more in defense industry. There are also some double standards and unfortunately problems within or between the allies, particularly restrictions on the defense industry product export. But European allies should spend more effort, and also we should increase our defense expanding, and non-EU allies shouldn't be excluded from such cooperation. But my last point, and the challenge, the major challenge in the nearest future or in the future. Now, for NATO, China is a challenge. I know very well that for our ally, United States, China is a threat. And US will continue pressing at the NATO meetings to qualify as China as a threat. In the document, we see China as a challenge. So this is, I think, one of the differences between European allies and United States. So in the case that China is qualified as a threat, what kind of decisions and the measures NATO will take, or can NATO take, to counterbalance China? This is the main question and concern to my mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Allow me a quick follow-up on the role of China. Considering that you mentioned the differences in perspective between Europe and the US, do you see the alliance going further in addressing the challenges coming from China as a potential factor of disunity in NATO?
I do agree with you. Yeah.
And do you have any potential solutions to how we can go about not achieving that?
This is actually what I was trying to explain, and we shouldn't seek new amenities. And you see, even despite the major differences between Russian Federation and China, now it seems that they are allies, particularly they are trying to take the support of the global south that is criticizing us as well. Therefore, yes, China is not an easy country, it's a challenge. We have also issues with China, but totally humanitarian issue, the human rights violations of the Uyghur Turks in Xinjiang region. This is totally humanitarian issue. But qualifying or seeing China as a threat is a totally different thing. I think we should be very careful over there.
Thank you. State Secretary Chernchets, Mr. Çavuşoğlu mentioned that European allies should spend more on defense, and I think this has been pretty much at this point established since the start of the war in Ukraine, that Europe does need to do more on defense. However, there still continues to be a lack of a unified vision among European leaders on how to actually achieve that. From your perspective, what do you see are the key barriers for us moving forward in terms of building, as some call it, a European pillar within NATO, and how might we overcome them?
Thank you for the question. Good day to you all. Yes, first I would like to share a few things about the Slovenian perspective, and then I will touch upon also the question what was asked about the European pillar. At the same time, or a month prior to the 75th anniversary of NATO, Slovenia celebrated 20th anniversary of being a NATO member. And I have to say, for us, I'm deeply convinced it was a success story, and still is, being a NATO member. After the war 91, we decided that we want to join NATO and European Union, and after 13 years, we joined in NATO, we joined to European Union, 1 month after the joining to the NATO. We tend to say those are the two sides of the same coin. I still believe this. So the same coin, two sides, NATO and EU. And this is also partly answering to the European part of the question. What I want to share also is that from our perspective, I think Slovenia proved itself in the last 2 decades that we were a security provider, not a security consumer. What I'm having in my mind is, of course, our presence in Western Balkans, in the missions abroad, as we say, providing security and safe environment. And after 25 years, still, NATO being present in Kosovo, for example, there is still a need to be there. And this is the answer for the future. So, was Europe capable of solve the crisis or frozen conflict or whatever you want to say, the situation that we have in Kosovo today? We are not able to solve it. And NATO presence, it's more needed than ever in Kosovo and in years to come, for sure. And Slovenia is going to be part of this for sure in the future. Defense spending. Yes, politically, we decided in Slovenia that, of course, we are going to have 2% of our GDP prior when we joined to NATO. Slovenian politics never delivered that. Doesn't matter which color the politicians came from, but the result is it was the same. Where we are now, in recent years, of course, we adopted a parliamentary resolution, and our plan is that we are going to reach this goal of 2% in 2030. We are going step by step towards this direction, and we seriously mean to deliver this. And it's not because NATO is saying that we have to do it. No, it was our own decision that we want to share the burden and that we want to be part of the story. So to be the security provider, not the security consumer. Capabilities, yes, of course, we discussed also with ACG about that. War in Ukraine showed us that how things changed. We know from the history that every future war won't be fought the same way as the previous one. This is the lessons learned that we are now extracting from Ukraine, all of us, and also NATO is extracting this, and we are going to do it also in Slovenia. And in this first part, I would like to say also a few words about what is important is when we address these topics is importance of that to have the public support for it. And in Slovenia, we have a lot of discussions how big is the support for NATO, whether decreased, increased, what are the numbers. And I always say it's exactly the same as it was in 2003. The ratio is same. As you know, we are one of the very rare countries that we have a referendum before we joined NATO. It was 2/3 versus 1/3. And if we would have a referendum, all the polls shows the same. Not as is tried to be presented sometimes in the public, how this support vanished in Slovenia. Maybe what is very typical for Slovenia, that some voices of minorities are much louder than the ones of majority. But this is more about how you do the public diplomacy in your own country about the NATO. So in European pillar, yes, this is more theoretical, academical question. I think NATO it has to work towards the unity, and we heard we are going to have some different opinions on different issues within the NATO. We don't need to have pillars. EU used to have pillars, but they abolished them. So I don't know if this is the right, from academic perspective, yes, but in real terms, I think military and dual-use capabilities within the NATO have to strengthen, and we should leave the European Union to be what it is in core, economic association, and of course, to upgrade what it's doing right now, and this is direct consequence of the war in Ukraine, to increase capabilities and capacities of defense industries, because we all felt asleep, not just in Europe, but also across the ocean.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up to, you mentioned the Slovenia strategy to reach 2% until 2030. And as we heard at the beginning from Assistant Secretary General Lapsley, 2% is now the floor and not anymore the ceiling, and the goal is more to reach 3%. So how does Slovenia have a vision to achieve these 3% after 2030, especially in the context of the public support that you were just talking about?
I think if we are going to reach the floor and the ceiling at 2%, we are going to be very happy.
We wish you all the best on that. Thank you. Yes, continuing, so one leader, I think, in Europe that has presented a vision for a stronger European defense is the French President Macron, and I think no one will be surprised now that I will turn to Mr. Escorcia for the next question. Considering President Macron's calls for a new European security architecture that does build heavily on the strategic autonomy, how does France see NATO evolving to address not only direct threats from Russia, but also what we have been discussing now, future increasing role of China as a decisive enabler, as the Washington Declaration has called it?
Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here among this distinguished audience with this distinguished panel and with this scenery, which I don't cease to marvel since I got here yesterday. So thank you so much to the organizers, Wilson Center, and to the Bled Strategic Forum. Listen, my president is well known for some of his formulas, so I will not repeat them here. But I will say, as a counterpoint, that today, and I think I speak for French policy in saying that we think the alliance has been revitalized very clearly, and that it owes it to our own efforts to keep our unity, to the leadership of the US administration, has to be said as well, but also in no small part to Vladimir Putin himself. And what we see today is that Vladimir Putin has essentially inflicted upon himself major strategic defeats, no matter what the outcome is on the ground or whatever at the end historically of the full-scale invasion. The defeats, strategic defeats as seen from the Kremlin are there, and they can't be hidden even from the public or even with whatever propaganda machine you have. He wanted a NATO that would be weakened and with fewer members or with members doubting it. We have Sweden in. He wanted less NATO troops at his borders. He has a reinforcement, the likes of which we haven't seen since the end of the Cold War, and in a purely defensive manner, obviously. And he wanted a weakened Ukraine, as far from NATO as possible, and he got a Ukraine that is reinforced, re-energized in the defense of its own territory, and closer to NATO than it has ever been. So all of these, not to mention Crimea, which was pretty much uncontested militarily, not politically, but militarily before 2022. Today, you see what it is. Not to mention Kursk Oblast, and first actually incursion of non-Russian troops or foreign troops on Russian soil since World War II. If I am a Putin spin doctor, I have trouble, explaining all of this away or spinning it in a way that Russia's winning. These are major strategic defeats for the Kremlin. It's not because we want Russian people to suffer or Russia to be defeated, but because we have to understand that in the end, you can't have a world in which might makes right. And NATO has played a big role in all of this. First of all, I think its deterrence has worked and that is very important. Angus explained why and all the plans and everything that's been in place. Also, the increased defense expenditure, and France has been taking its part in all of this, as you know, as framework nation in Romania, in the forward land forces. Also, contribution to Estonia battle group alongside the UK, and contribution to the enhanced vigilance activities all across the eastern flank with all of our armed forces. We have been at the center of all of this and re-engaging in NATO activities to a degree that we hadn't actually in years past, and by the end of the kind of expeditionary area of NATO, where France was less engaged in NATO operations. Today, France is fully engaged, is slated to take on command of the Allied Response Force in 2026. And so we are fully engaged in all of these reassurance activities, and also, of course, in support to Ukraine to the tune of over 5 billion euros since the full-scale aggression unleashed. And as Angus mentioned, also the nuclear dimension. France is a nuclear power. And although outside of the NATO nuclear fora, we contribute and we play our role in also the nuclear deterrence, as Angus mentioned. So I think all of this is rather, as was said, a success story for all of us collectively. And I think that, of course, we are prone to self-doubt, but we need to put that out there and also put it out to our publics. Secondly, how do we continue to be relevant and as successful as we were in the past 75 years in the years to come? I think among many things that have been said, three stand out in my view. One is to continue to take into account security concerns of all allies. And we have a sacred commitment in Article 5. It's a pretty strong one. It's the strongest one there is. And for that commitment to be operational, it has to be credibly understood by each ally that all of their security concerns are taken into consideration. This is not easy. It takes what they call in NATO a 360 approach, but it takes a lot of consultation also among allies, which is what we've been trying to reinforce, to make sure that we understand each other and there's no misunderstandings, or as little as possible. Second, we need to talk more and do more with our partners. So obviously for us, the European Union is a unique and essential partner of NATO, but beyond the NATO-EU institutional mechanisms, we need to find a way to overlap better and to work better together with the European Union and European security affairs, but also, as Minister Çavuşoğlu mentioned, with partners from the South. I think there is a lot to be done, and there was a report ahead of Washington and some decisions made that can be very interesting in order to better address the challenges that were mentioned coming from the South, but also the predatory strategies by Russia, China, and other players in the South, but also partners in this region, the Western Balkans, which has a particularity of having both members of NATO and partners of NATO, and which in many ways is unfinished business for NATO. And third, and is regard to your question and what was mentioned earlier about further pursuits, I think we need to recognize that obviously we have to have an appreciation as precise as possible of the impact of what's going on outside our area, within, for our peace and our security of the Euro-Atlantic area. It needs to be a good analysis, and it needs to be measured in order to avoid any effects of self-fulfilling prophecies or indeed alignments that we do not want. And for that reason, we still see, as France, rather skeptical any forays out of area, particularly in Asia, or out of topic in areas such as economic security or resilience that are better handled either nationally or in a good cooperation with the European Union. But I think there will be an area that will spark indeed further discussion, as you said, as we move forward with NATO, but we need to have a clear and precise assessment. I would just conclude by saying we're an alliance of democracy. It's also what sets us apart. And democracies debate, deliberate, sometimes they err, but they have the ability to correct course. And this is what is unique among democracies and what is unique for this alliance, and what I think will preserve it and make it stronger still in the next 75 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Going on from that, we talked a lot about now calls for stronger European defense, for Europe to do more on its own, and these calls are stemming also from certain uncertainty from the European allies when it comes to the upcoming presidential elections in the US in November, and what will they mean for the future of the transatlantic alliance. And I will turn to you now, Ambassador Rieker. Looking at all these developments, when the NATO Secretary General was in Washington in June and then later in July, he made a strong claim that European security is still in the interest of the US in matters of also US security, its leadership, but also in terms of its defense industry. So looking at all of these recent developments that we have been talking about and the future, how do you assess the future unity and resolve of NATO? And can potentially these calls for greater European efforts calm down a bit this, let's call it anxiety in terms of burden sharing concerns and safeguard the future of NATO?
Well, thank you, Masha. And I would just point out that, of course, Secretary General Stoltenberg spoke at the Wilson Center when he came to Washington in June as a preview for the NATO 75th anniversary summit. We were very honored to have him, and it underscores the work we're doing. And I'm delighted to be a part of that with you and with Robin and our team, and to be partnering with the Bled Strategic Forum. So I want to thank our hosts and the government of Slovenia, the Foreign Ministry for putting this together. I think it's absolutely appropriate that we're here in Central Europe, in a country that joined NATO 20 years ago, that, as we've heard, contributes in its own unique way, along with now 31 other allies. And so, to answer the question, an alliance fit for the future and what you've talked about, I'm actually fairly optimistic on that point, and that comes from what we saw at the NATO summit. And frankly, what we see here on this panel, partially because it's about geography. And I'm delighted to be joined by Angus, who's not just the NATO Assistant Secretary General, but from the United Kingdom. Let's remember, as I tried to tell my colleagues in London when I was heading our mission there for a year, the UK is still part of Europe. It may not be in the European Union, but it's part of Europe, and it is part of NATO, and a critical, important ally, a nuclear power as well. And we have Turkey here, and you know, I spent so many meetings with Minister Çavuşoğlu, both with Secretary Pompeo and with Secretary Blinken, consulting as a NATO ally, as a partner. Not always the easiest of discussions, as you know, but as we've heard, countries in this alliance can have those difficult discussions and work them out because we share a particular bond. And I came away from the NATO summit feeling very positive that remains. There is a unity of purpose, much of that brought to the fore by Putin's actions, and we've heard about that and the mistake he's made in thinking that perhaps NATO wasn't up to the defense and deterrence role that it's had. We talk so much about burden sharing and the money, and the good news was, of course, we've made enormous progress there. It's not perfect, it's not done. It probably never will be, in a sense that we'll always be striving for more to meet the goals that we've set for ourselves, now at 32, but to meet ever-increasing goals. Some countries spending well beyond 2% on defense. It's not on NATO, it's on defense, and NATO is then the collection of that defense, collective action, which coordinates and provides, of course, a focus on capabilities. I think we had very positive news there. When it comes to the US election, obviously I'm not going to make any predictions, but clearly there is a very real race. And having done a transition from multiple administrations over the years, but being brought back from European Command, where I was the civilian deputy, the policy advisor to the commander in 2019, by Secretary Pompeo to lead the European Bureau, it does tell you something about what he was looking for in terms of how the State Department was approaching Europe. And very much what we did at EUCOM, which was a return to strategy, a focus on meeting the challenge that Putin had put forward after we, after all, by our own accord, drew down forces in Europe, thinking that we had an opportunity to approach Russia more as a partner, as it was defined by NATO for many, many years. And even though that period was one in which the transatlantic waters were, shall we say, choppy, whitecaps in the transatlantic relationship. Some would call it rock bottom. I've heard that term. Frankly, we were doing an awful lot, much of it in that level of the ocean where it's calm, where you're not seeing or hearing the public dialogue. We were focused on NATO, a forward-looking review process that was extremely successful in analyzing the challenges, looking at our own strengths and weaknesses as partners, and reinforcing what was important. That led to a new NATO strategic concept that we've seen put out that addresses some of these key new challenges, the hybrid threats, what, as Angus described, the Russians are doing every day to try to challenge us. We can meet those challenges. And I think it's important, at the 75th anniversary, we sort of looked back at what NATO had addressed and dealt with over 75 years, what brought NATO together in the first place, and reminded us of the original cause of allies working together, and that was the defeat of fascism in Europe, and then to defend against a Stalinist Soviet threat. And we did that extremely successfully. Ups and downs, differences with the French, expanding then at the end of the Cold War, lots of unexpected events, including not far from here in the Balkans with the breakup of Yugoslavia and what we thought were horrific wars then. Now we see a horrific war also outside of NATO's own border, but with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and we're meeting that challenge. So it's not just about the money, it's about the desire of not just governments, but people and populations. And we've heard already, you see, Finland and Sweden joining an alliance that just a few years ago, when I was at command, always considered the idea that those two countries as allies was never going to happen. They were extraordinarily close partners. In fact, I can remember my commander saying, if every ally was as good a partner as Sweden and Finland, we'd be in great shape. Well, events happen, and not only did we welcome them into the alliance, but their populations agreed with that. This is an alliance by choice, and that can't be said of the partnering that you see of some of the others in the world, whether it's Russia and China, Iran, North Korea. These are players that we have to counter, we have to deal with, and I think we're very capable of that. My transition to the private sector has told me that the private sector understands how important security is. And they have to continually be educated about that. And they, in turn, use their levers of influence on governments to say, hey, this is important to us. The reason that we live as we do, certainly in the West, the reason that we have these differences with the global South, which they're not happy about, is because in the transatlantic space, we created, after World War II, a set of institutions and structures that gave us security. First and foremost, a security that then allowed a level of prosperity that in 1947 or 49 would have been thought absolutely unachievable. And that includes in this part of the world and further east, this part of Europe, never would have been expected. But we did that because we have security. Regardless of what you hear out of any administration or the White House, the importance is remembering that the bridges are built on trade, on investment, on personal engagement, on individual histories, on shared cultural experiences and shared values. Those will remain, and as I used to tell my European colleagues during some of the more stressful years, the Trump administration, if you feel that we're burning bridges, just don't burn them from the other side so that we can make sure we have those structures to rebuild. And in the trade and investment space, you're talking in the trillions of dollars. That is something that we need to continue to reinforce with security, and we have a purpose there. So I'm positive, and I hate to see headlines in the media. I know they probably sold more copies of the Bled Strategic Forum newspaper because it talked about Armageddon. Come on, people, we need to focus and go back to those Rooseveltian terms. We have nothing to fear but fear itself. When we overcome that, I think we can accomplish everything. And so The alliance is very fit for the future. It takes hard work, it takes cooperation, but we have all of the pieces in which to do that.
Thank you. I think these are very important words of reassurance for this this audience, I would say, and also excellent points on the role of shared values and the unity of purpose. So going beyond just thinking about the 2% and the money. And speaking of unity of purpose, that was also brought together by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think from the Washington summit, this was clearly one thing that allies completely agreed on was continued support for Ukraine. There was the establishment of the NATO security assistance and training for Ukraine, and also a long-term pledge for supporting Ukraine fighting an aggressor. But I think NATO is also learning a lot from the conventional warfare and the war itself in Ukraine. And I will turn now to Ms. Quimwell and ask, what do you see are some lessons learned that when it comes to building resilience and future capabilities? And maybe to just go on from here, as we talked a lot about also the potential path of Ukraine towards NATO memberships, can these lessons that NATO is integrating now be an advantage for Ukraine for its irreversible path to NATO?
Thank you, Masha. The first thing I'm going to do is say there are 4 seats in the front row. 4 of you over there that are training for Ironman or something like that, please come and take these seats, okay? Yeah, there are labels on them. Those folks can't possibly be coming now. Do this, all right? Okay. Still one? Yeah, there we are. All right. Okay, I've done that, you know, the standing in the room. So, okay, to answer your question, Masha. First, I think that one of the, if there's an overarching lesson that we are learning from Ukraine, it is that NATO as an alliance needs to double down on deterrence, right? This is what was its foundation at the start, and as we are seeing a country, Russia, ready to invade another country and change borders by force, what that means is we double down on deterrence. Deterrence, of course, as many here have said, takes capabilities. That's important. My talking points on 2% were substantially the same during the Trump and Biden administrations, right? Why? Because deterrence, you can't deter if you don't have capabilities that are robust, right? So it's less about the sum or the percentage than making sure you're meeting those capability goals that NATO is so good at coordinating among the allies so that their defense is robust. We don't know in the 75 years that are coming exactly what all of the challenges will be. So we need to deal with what we do know now and do the investment that means that our capabilities are ready to sync up together for the fights that we can see or the threats that we can see, and then be ready to address the new ones. And this actually is the genius of NATO, that it is able to reinvent itself in that way. There are, of course, some practical lessons that we are learning from this war on the ground in Ukraine. And I'm just going to mention a couple of those. Well, and I'll tell you a secret. In January 2022, when it looked like something was really going to be happening in Ukraine, I thought that war would start with a cyber war, frankly. And instead, what we've seen is a ground war. And in fact, I think this has taken even generals by surprise, that it has been that kind of ground war. So it is worth remembering that we need to have the capabilities also to fight a ground war, and those capabilities need to be in a state of readiness, right? Just a fact. We also have seen that air defense is important because that is what Ukraine is needing and using in order to make sure that it can protect its civilian infrastructure, including energy, because in this, what we have seen is that energy is a weapon not only with Russia, Ukraine, but also Russia trying to cut off its European sources. The There is another capability that we have seen utilized in this war, and that is unmanned aerial vehicles, or I'm just going to say it as drones because we all know what that is, right? Even though some of my colleagues would say, Robin, that's imprecise. Okay. At the Wilson Center, we have asked our global fellow, Jack Watling, to do a series on what we are learning from UAVs, the use of drones in Ukraine. Ukraine has been incredibly innovative in this field, and we can learn from that. Some of the things we're seeing is, first, if you're going to use drones and build drones, build them for the task. Don't make them an expensive multitasking thing that some of our defense departments love to imagine, design, and build for to be, massively expensive and ready for every threat. No, design them for what the various needs are, keep them cost effective. Also, remember that you need to be able to change the software on these every 6 to 12 weeks, because that is the nature of the fight on the ground, and this is what you're up against. You need to be able to do that. And you also need to make sure that you are looking ahead to what is next, which is how you counter the use of drones. And we are seeing all of this play out on the ground in Ukraine in a way that we had not anticipated seeing in this intensity. So we are learning from that. And for the record, Jack's work is free on the website, and we're coming up on his counter-drone paper this fall, because right now, to put it in a sports metaphor, we're using a really expensive Major League Baseball titanium bat to hit a gnat, right? And this is not cost-effective in the long run. And finally, one of the practical lessons from the ground is that I think we need to keep in mind as an alliance that a broad definition of security is important because we see energy being used as a weapon. We see that it is important to protect supply chains in order to make sure that those capabilities you've invested in, you are able to continue to use and replace. And you also need to keep in mind the importance of food security in any future fight. So those are the kind of practical lessons that we are learning from the fight on the ground, and there will be many more. What we have really seen, though, is the power of the alliance, the consultative nature of the alliance, the use of consultations in advance to share intelligence, to share assessments, to coordinate deterrent actions, and to be able to say, we intend to take deterrent actions. If you take this step, we will act as an alliance, we will act as individual countries. Sometimes that is to say, we will sanction you, and we will sanction you hard. Okay, we have done that as countries. To be ready, and also to say, right, we will also be ready to act in case of this war. And this is where I actually want to say that the European Union has been extraordinarily generous in its aid to refugees, and I think we always have to keep in mind how much countries are doing on that front. This has enabled them to come to Europe and to be ready to actually return when there is eventually peace in Ukraine. There are some lessons that I think we are still learning. We, I think, have lagged behind on provision of equipment. We have taken this in steps. We have sometimes been too slow. It is very hard for planners in Ukraine to do planning when they don't know whether or not they will have funding or be able to have capabilities that they are hoping that they will have. So it is worth learning that lesson, that perhaps we need to be able, as countries, to act more quickly when it comes to this kind of threat. But we need perhaps also to think about the caveats that we place on the use of equipment. Again, a lesson we are still learning. And I think what we are really learning is that our support must match our rhetoric, and that that is the only way that it can be sustainable. You asked a little bit about whether this will help Ukraine's path into NATO. And the area that I see is that they are working with equipment provided by NATO countries, so they are learning that equipment. They are becoming able to operate that, but also they are training. And we, as Wilson, took a group to the UK and we watched training that was happening out in the middle of Norfolk somewhere for Ukrainian troops. It was impressive to watch. All of these steps that are happening there at Grafenwehr, elsewhere, are integrating the kind of approach to fighting that we have as NATO allies into what colleagues in Ukraine are doing in the fight. And so just that step alone is helpful. But also, as we are strategizing, working closely together, you can see this will be a step forward. And of course, we'll have the NATO office in Kyiv. So I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you. One of your points mentioned the role of modern technology and looking ahead to what's next. And I think that's where investment and innovation play an important role. NATO has already done a lot with initiatives such as the NATO Innovation Fund and Diana. But to maintain a competitive edge with countries like Russia and China, who are investing a lot as well in these capabilities, NATO will need to do even more in terms of investment, but also harnessing talent that we have when it comes to innovation. And I will turn now to Mr. De Luca. Could you maybe share a bit more about what do you think could be some further steps that the Alliance can take to better harness the talent we already have for fostering defense innovation?
First of all, thank you again for this year to invite me and to share ideas. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine, the hybrid and cyber threats remind us that peace in Europe cannot be taken for granted. And so it means that the NATO must be vigilant and ready to face these new challenges. But the vigilance is not enough. We have to build long-term capabilities and innovation, invest in cutting-edge technologies. It could be the key. But I would like to stress that it's not a problem of money, but is a problem of will and responsibility. And the issue of innovation, I think that could be interpreted, viewed inside the balance between the role of NATO's and the responsibility of Europe. I think that Europe has to take care more on its own defense. It means investing in technologies, investing dual use, military, and so on. If you imagine that that Europe spend 1/3 of as a whole of what US spend on defense, you understand that is not a problem of money, but is a will and a responsibility. And if you want to build a stronger European identity inside NATO, we have to be more concerned about the problem of the European strategic autonomy. And about this, Mario Draghi, the former president of European Central Bank and the former Italian Prime Minister, on the mandate of Ursula von der Leyen, is going to release in the next days a report on competitiveness. And I had the opportunity to read the first draft, and at the first recommendation is not the rhetoric of competition and so on, but this is the investment in the defense and security sector through 3 points mainly. First, the full access to European funding. Second, about the merger that could be allowed without any concern for competition and regulation. That is very important. And also with some exception for the aid of states. Third, the European...
Hybrid bread. Yeah, it's hybrid.
And the first one is the European preference principle that would be introduced to prioritize the defense solution of European over the external competitors. So as you can see, the investment in technologies, in security, and in defense will build a new European industrial policy on defense. We want in these reports that it could be one of the polar of the new commission chaired by the President Ursula von der Leyen, that on this report is to build a European giant on this defense and security sector, and in perspective, having a stronger Europe in this sector, in the technological age, could also support the run for the technological supremacy between China and US, because we have to say that the principle of reality says that Europe is not so strong, so we have to ally with our key ally, that is United States. So you have to choose between China and the United States, and of course there is no choice on that. And of course Italy is one of the most close ally of United States, so we are very concerned on this, to be stronger in Europe and to be stronger in NATO, and our government is committed to spend the 2% of the GDP in this defense because of this. So innovation, the rhetorical innovation, pass through not only money but will and responsibility.
Thank you, and I think the role of European Union in future defense investments and defense industry is of course important, and I think we could have another hour and 15 minutes just to discuss that. But I see that we are approaching the time for questions from the audience, and with what we have been discussing and opening a lot of new questions, I'm pretty sure there is a lot of questions from the audience. I was first told that I should encourage participants from the Young Bled Strategic Forum to raise their hands as well. So if there's anyone from there, please. Then we'll start. Yeah, we will start with them and then continue. Yes, please shortly introduce yourself. If you have a specific question, mention that. Otherwise, we will decide who will address it.
Yeah, my name is Alex. I'm from Latvia. I'm working at the MFA of Latvia. A couple of days ago, we had a discussion, and the American ambassador here said that the war in Ukraine is existential for us. And as someone who comes from Baltic states, I fully agree with that. Last year, actually, from previous head of Estonian defense forces, I heard an opinion that the war in Ukraine will not end in our favor unless one of those three things happen. First, China will turn against Russia. Second, Russians will turn against Putin. And third, NATO or US gonna get engaged in the conflict. As I don't think first two things gonna happen, third is more likely. And from the perspective of the Baltics and Poland, if the war drages on, I think at some point we're going to approach the point when people in our countries would say, enough is enough. We have to have our troops in Ukraine, at least to protect, border with Belarus, so that Ukraine can shift those troops to the east. So maybe you can elaborate on that idea and answer the question, is NATO doing enough to ensure that Ukraine wins the war? I don't know who to address. Maybe you can help with that.
Would anyone like to volunteer to take this? Mr. Lapti?
Well, first of all, on your three observations, I think that's probably right about China. But I would say that China's behavior during this war and its strong support for Russia, its material, its economic support for Russia, I think it is changing perceptions of China within the alliance. And as Minister Kazavoglu pointed out, there's a finely balanced debate about exactly how do you talk about China. But the realities are changing, and they're changing quite fast because of the way China is behaving. But on part three of your question, so I think there's quite an important difference between NATO getting involved in the war in Ukraine directly, which actually no ally is calling for, and is not the view of the alliance that would be a good thing. There's quite a difference between that and us needing to do more collectively as allies to support Ukraine in its fight. And I think that's where the focus is and where it needs to be. And that's why at the Washington summit, the lead, isn't it? 32 important countries got together and said, we will double down on support for Ukraine. We will make sure we get $40 billion in over the next 12 months, etc. Now, I think there's all sorts of interesting questions about whether we could go a bit further and faster on some of the ways in which we support Ukraine, and lots of people would argue, I think rightly, that we should. But I think it's really important to maintain the distinction between that and the idea that NATO should start fighting in this war, for which there is really no support.
And can I add in here that Ukraine gets a voice in this? Because in your three scenarios, that left out quite a lot of Ukraine, and I think Angus's point that there can be more that we can do is actually key here.
Where are the microphones? You have 3 questions here together.
Thank you very much. Simeon Tsomokos from the Delphi Economic Forum in Greece. Great comments, and we thank you all very much. I think the speakers wisely, they didn't mention the elephant in the room. What is your take if we have a re-election of President Trump, and what is going to be in the alliance if Trump is re-elected? Thank
you. Who wants to? Yeah, Mr.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this good question. And I was also attending the summits, NATO summits that President Trump was dominating. And he never actually spent any words undermining NATO. And he rightly criticized President Macron for his statement that NATO is brain dead or something like that. But he was criticizing European allies for not two reasons, for not reaching 2% defense spending goal. To my mind, we have to be flexible there, because some countries, like take Luxembourg as an example, and where Luxembourg should spend this money, only 600 soldiers. Instead of spending for these equipments, they should contribute to NATO activities and NATO missions, for instance. That is another story. But Trump was at each summit criticizing for not reaching that goal and for the lack of equitable revenue sharing. I mean, the equitable sharing. That was his point. And at each summit, I remember very well, after lecturing us how America was great under his administration or leadership, he was attacking the European leaders. he was excluding President Erdogan, I don't know why, and also Slovenia, because his wife is from Slovenia, and he was, so you will be safe if he is elected, okay? So and I remember what, on 2% spending, defense spending goal, what Prime Minister Orban said. He said, you know, I have to decide to invade all my neighbors to reach that goal, right or not? So we have to be flexible there. I don't see any reason to be concerned of the possible election of President Trump on NATO, but on other issues, US trade restrictions, it will be a legitimate concern if there is anyone. Thank you.
You want to? Okay, go ahead.
Hi to everybody. My name is Roman Jakic. I'm the former defense minister of Slovenia and chairman of the Liberal Southeast European Network. Yesterday you heard Slovenes are very dedicated to bring on the board the Western Balkan countries. Alexander Dugin, the brain of Putin, said recently in one of the interviews that the Russians must, when he was very positively speaking about the Serbian politics, he said that they will finish what they started in the Western Balkan. So while, and I experienced this as the head of the OSCE ODIHR mission in Montenegro in 2016 as the head of that mission with the attempt of coup there. So my question is, due to the fact that they are basically finishing what they started, and recently we started to talk about the strategies and the actions, what we will do with the Western Balkans and the influence of the Russians in that area. I'm just questioning, are we fit for the fight in the future to basically fight that gap and advance they already have? Thank you.
First.
I would like to answer my Slovenian colleague in English. The term of Balkanization as an implosion of the countries was developed in the Balkans after the First World War. And my thesis is, and the biggest nightmare of the West is that we are going to see after the war in Ukraine, Balkanization of Russia. This is one of the consequences that can happen and is very realistic. If we saw the implosion of Soviet Union, why not the Russia? But and this is the direct answer, I would like to share also two small points. I'm very happy that we discussed today a little bit also about resilience, because resilience became the number of words within the NATO, full spectrum approach with infrastructure, and we saw what happened in Ukraine. It's not just about military capabilities, but resilience of society. And that we all remember ourselves that it's not only about Article 5 within the NATO, but also about Article 3, which is telling us that individual capability for the defense is basically a pillar or cornerstone of the joint effort that we are going to, that we have to address for the future. And this is this high level that we had for the future is one of the most important things for the future within the alliance.
Certainly, as you all know, there was an agreement between European partners, the European Union, the United States, in the early years after the Kosovo War. How would we address the Western Balkan questions? And that was to integrate all of those countries into Euro-Atlantic institutions. And I think NATO has been a big part of that. For much of my career, I was focused on that as part of the broader transatlantic security architecture, and had a big hand in bringing in Montenegro and North Macedonia as, at that point, the 29th and 30th allies in NATO. I think that's crucial. I think that still has the strong support of their populations as well as governments that have changed democratically since they've come into the alliance. I think they contribute. I think they're part of the unity. And the idea that Russia somehow holds the cards in the Western Balkans, I find somewhat suspect. Yes, they play the usual games. They love seeing disputes frozen. They love disinformation, all kinds of hybrid efforts. But what have they ever done for the countries of the Western Balkans? You go to Serbia and you ask people in surveys, this was true 25 years ago, it's true today. What country has given the most support to Serbia for reforms, for development, for change? And they'll often say Russia. Russia's given nothing to these countries. The European Union has done, enormous amounts of support. US programs for many, many years did that. So I think we should keep in perspective what that is. Where it is disappointing is to see the remaining countries of the Western Balkans on their Euro-Atlantic integration, even those that have joined NATO, still stuck on the European Union path. And that's something that the United States cannot do for them. We can continue to work on that path, and there have been plenty of discussions here from colleagues and friends, Miro Lajčák and others, about the enlargement and the question of moving ahead on that. I would say it's crucial because you've seen 2 generations of young people grow up in these countries who are Europeans and want to be part of the EU, of Europe as it's known in that sense, of the single market, of what it means to be part of the EU. And that's something that needs to continue working on. But I think the resilience is there. These countries know where they want to be, and there's a reason we call them the Western Balkans, is because they're Western-oriented, and with the help of all of the allies, including many of those represented here on this panel, we will continue to support those countries in their own self-determination.
Thank you, and I think that's a good point to end on when speaking about an alliance fit for the future. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, and we'll have to conclude this session. I would just like to thank all of our panelists for a really excellent discussion. I feel answering the question, how will NATO be fit for the future? I think doubling down on deterrence and resilience seems to be what the focus should be, and that this is really a common point of unity that is necessary for NATO to move to the next anniversary of 75 years. So please give a round of applause to all of our panelists. Thank you.